Now Daniel 7 is all kinds of crazy, but it's not like anything in Daniel has been normal so far, so we're okay. Daniel has a dream in 549 BC, the beginning of the co-regency of King Nabonidus and his son Belshazzar. Now the first half of the chapter is the narration of the symbolic dream, which includes myth, symbol, allegory, scriptural allusion, and revelation concerning things above and things yet to come in the future. The second half of the chapter is the interpretation of the dream. Now the symbols in Daniel 7 have been viewed as code. For example, the lion has been understood as Babylon, the small horn, Antiochus IV Epiphanes. The winds show the power of God effecting his will, whereas the sea shows chaos that threatens to disrupt God's order. The animals in the dream correspond to the four metals of chapter 2. Each is fierce and dangerous. Now the first three resemble one kind of animal, but have features of another. In the Old Testament, such hybrids implied a breach of the natural order. Members of different species mating together goes against creation, which is why the emphasis is made in Genesis chapter 1, according to their kinds. In Hellenistic Palestine, hybrid creatures on charms and amulets symbolize demonic forces. Now the fourth animal is described without being named. Horns can imply the battle elephant, thus suggesting it represents Greece, who began to use elephants in the time of Alexander the Great. Now the small horn responsible for overthrowing the three is Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Antiochus will be allowed to control events for a time, times, and half a time. Now this has commonly been taken as a cryptic way of saying 3.5 years. And it can be applied to the time between the desecration of the temple in 167 BC to its rededication in 164 BC, which was about 3 years and 10 days. Now that phrase, time, times, and half a time, does not necessarily mean 3.5 years. In Hebrew, the word adon, translated into English as time, can mean year, but it can also simply mean a period of time. The message is that Antiochus, who precipitated the greatest crisis in the history of the Jews between the destruction of Jerusalem in 587 BC and the events that took place in the 1st century AD, has an allotted time to reign, but it will end. In other words, evil will not stand forever. The court that is set up shows the Ancient of Days, the judge, who exercises complete authority. Fire symbolizes divinity. Now he is responsible for the death of the fourth creature who sets itself up against God's purposes. The first three animals are not killed. They are stripped of their authority, but allowed to live and join in honoring the new kingship of the Lord. Now this tells us that though a person may fall away from the Lord or act in rebellion against Jesus, they can receive grace and forgiveness if they repent and acknowledge Jesus as Lord. Now when the dream comes to an end, and even after it has been explained, and even in the light of the coming of Christ, Daniel is still troubled by this dream. This does not encourage us to assume that we have yet reached understanding. When God acts, it is commonly in ways other than his people anticipate. Jesus' birth, ministry, and death were not what people expected of the Messiah. Daniel is mystified and confused, but hopeful and open to surprise. Exegetical notes. In verse 2, it mentions the sea. The sea is often depicted as chaotic, against the natural order of God's creation. In verse 4, we see the four great beasts. While these can be compared to the four parts of the statue in Daniel 2, they represent four kingdoms beginning with Jerusalem's fall and ending with the time of great persecution of the Jews. Verse 4 shows the lion with four wings. The lion is a symbol of ferocity, strength, and destructiveness. It can be used for a nation or individual, particularly kingship. The eagle represents speed. Here, the lion represents Babylon, as the gold represented Nebuchadnezzar, which coincides with the fate of the lion eagle. It is reduced from being able to soar above the earth to experiencing the limitations of mere humanity, much like Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 4. In verse 5, we see the second beast. This bear-like creature is a source of fear to humans. The bear represents the Median Empire. Traditionally, the Aramaic from Hebrew alalion is translated as ribs, in which case it could represent conquered kings, conquered empires, conquered cities, or conquered peoples. In verse 6, we see the leopard. The leopard is a fearsome predator with great speed and is used to represent Persia. The Persians were known for their speedy armies. The four wings and heads could represent the four Persian kings, which we will see in Daniel chapter 11. In verse 7, we see the fourth beast. The fourth animal is described without being named. As mentioned before, it could be an elephant, which came to be a particular symbol for Alexander the Great and for Antiochus III. Antiochus IV's use of elephants was well known. It seems likely, then, the fourth beast represents Greece. Now, verse 7 mentions the 10 horns. This is often used to refer to 10 kings. The number 10 might not signify an actual number, and you can look at the paragraph in your booklets for a historical argument for 10 kings leading up to Antiochus IV. Verse 8 mentions another horn. It is generally agreed that the small horn represents Antiochus IV Epiphanes. In verse 9, Daniel states, "As I looked." Within the vision, Daniel moves from events taking place on earth to events taking place simultaneously in a separate dimension, that is heaven. The Ancient of Days stands for the eternal God. In verse 11, it mentions the beast was slain. The first three animals were under control. The fourth decides for itself what to do. While Antiochus is mouthing his arrogance, a court is being calmly set up, and a judge is serenely taking his seat. Though the one who kills the fourth beast is unstated, the passive verb implies God or his agent. Execution by burning was a familiar idea and a common way of speaking of divine punishment. The language of Daniel 7:11 through 12, like that of Daniel 8:10, is symbolic and draws on Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28, which speak of earlier rulers, specifically Assyria and Tyre, whose pride led them to have pretensions of deity. Their pride became their downfall. Interestingly, Antiochus IV died suddenly in December of 164 BC while robbing a temple in Persia. The same time, forces under Judas Maccabeus recaptured the temple, cleansed it, and rededicated it to the Lord. Verse 12 highlights the other beasts. The first three beasts are stripped of their authority, but they live on, ready to join in honoring the new kingship. Verse 13 mentions one like a son of man. In both Aramaic and Hebrew, the phrase son of man denotes a human being. First, there are individual interpretations. A few have suggested a historical deliverer of the Jews, such as Judas Maccabeus. Many Christians have applied the term to Jesus. The cloud imagery has led some to argue that a supernatural angelic figure is intended, noting that elsewhere in Daniel, angels have a human appearance. The figure has then usually been identified with Michael, the angelic prince of the Jews. Consult your booklets for a list of other possibilities. In verse 16, Daniel states he goes to one of those standing there. Daniel instinctively turns to one of the celestial beings for understanding. Verse 18 mentions the holy people of the Most High. Some scholars conclude that the term holy people of the Most High refers to the angelic counterpart of Israel. Verse 25 states he will speak against the Most High. This alludes to the desecration of the temple in 169 BC. In verse 26, it mentions the court. The death and destruction of the fourth creature is effected through the death of Antiochus. Both the rededication of the temple and Antiochus's death would be seen as partial fulfillments of the promise in verses 26 through 27. Daniel 7 is one of the most interesting chapters in the entire Bible. The relevance for the church today is terrifying, especially in light of the nuclear age. Humanity now has the power to destroy itself and the world in which it lives. Now, there is something theologically quite novel about this situation. God has allowed humanity to discover how to bring an end to the story He began. As tensions continue to increase in the Middle East, North Korea, and even domestically, we find ourselves wondering if and when God will intervene. Yet, we are reminded that the power of the Seleucid monarchy, from which Antiochus IV came, was not broken in the 160s BC, even after the rededication of the temple. In the same way, the power of Rome was not broken when Christ came. Evil was still allowed to persist. Our longing for God's kingdom continues to be frustrated, though we do see evil's power diminishing, which strengthens our conviction that we will see God's dominion endure and triumph once and for all. And until that time, we wait patiently, comforted by the peace and joy we have in the Lord.